Chapter 2, Lesson 3 of Geometry. Going to look at some logic skills now. We're going to look at deductive reasoning. And earlier this year we talked about inductive reasoning, where we look at patterns and we try to determine what the next term or the next item will be in the pattern based upon what we see. Deductive reasoning is different. Deductive reasoning is we reason from facts, and then using those facts we come to a conclusion based upon those facts. And we have to apply certain rules of logic in order to decide that these things are going to be true or not. So we're going to talk about two laws of logic. They're called the law of detachment and the law of syllogism. We'll tackle for video, so let's take a look at law of detachment first. Deductive reasoning is the process of reasoning logically from given statements, and this is very key here. We can only reason from given statements, and it's important that as we're discussing and using these laws of reasoning that we really hold to that rule, is that you have to reason from given statements. You can't bring in outside knowledge, you can't bring in outside statements that haven't been stated in order to reason logically. You can only reason from what's given. And if the given statements are true, then the deductive reasoning produces what are true conclusions. But again, we can only use reason from statements that are given. And many people use deductive reasoning in their jobs. A physician who's trying to diagnose an illness will take a look at all the facts, all the different symptoms, and then based upon those come to a conclusion. Or a carpenter determining what materials needed, or a mechanic who's looking at a car and has to diagnose what the problem is. They all use deductive reasoning, and these are very important. But again, when they're using the deductive reasoning, they only reason from what's given. When a patient or when a doctor is trying to diagnose a patient, he doesn't bring in symptoms from another patient in his decision. It's only the symptoms of this patient is what we're dealing with, or only the materials needed for this job. So we have to reason only from given statements. So deductive reasoning is a logical process reasoning from given statements, and if the statements are true and you apply the rules properly, then you will get true conclusions. Now, the law of detachment says this: if the conditional is true and the hypothesis is true, then the conclusion is true. So there's two things that you have to consider first. Is the conditional itself true? And then two, is the hypothesis true? Meaning, has the condition been met? And it's only once the condition has been met can we then draw the conclusion that the conditional puts forth. So the law of detachment uses true conditionals and a true hypothesis to reach a true conclusion. So there's a couple questions, processes that you need to go through when you're doing these types of problems or you're doing reasoning. First of all, you must consider, is the conditional itself true? And in 99% of the cases that we're talking about, the conditional will be true. But it is something you must consider. If the answer to that is yes, then you can go to your next question. If the answer to that question is no, meaning the conditional is not true, then you can stop, because you can't apply laws of logic unless the conditional is true to begin with. So if the answer is yes, then what you have to consider is the hypothesis true, meaning not is it true, but is the condition been met? We're talking about conditional statements. If something happens, or if something is true, or if something is fulfilled, then you can make the conclusion. So after deciding that the conditional is true, you then have to consider, is the hypothesis true? Well, that means you have to know what the hypothesis is. And how do we figure out what the hypothesis is? We look for the word if, and then what's following the word if, we say that's the condition. Is that condition met? And if that's met, if it's yes, we apply the law of detachment and say, well, then the conclusion is going to happen. If the answer is no, the condition's not been met, then we cannot apply the law of logic. Okay, so let me do a few examples here. Well, a few things to note. Most of the time on these problems, you're going to have to explain why you can use the law of detachment or why you can't. And the explanation is, again, you don't go into this long explanation about the conditional itself. You just address the fact that the condition has or has not been met. So if you cannot use the law of detachment, you simply state the condition has not been met. All right? And again, to reemphasize, you cannot use any statements or knowledge other than what's given. You can only reason from what's given. You can't bring in outside knowledge. You can only deal with what's given. So let's take a look at our first example, keeping these two questions in mind that we have to look at. If a student gets an A on a final exam, then the student will pass the course. Is that in itself true? Well, yes, if you get an A on the exam, you will pass the course. Then the second statement is that Felicia gets an A on the music theory final exam. So what we do is we consider, is the condition itself true? Yes, that's a true conditional, so that is true, right? So now we consider, has the hypothesis been met? Meaning, what's the hypothesis? We find the word if. It says a student gets an A on the final. And then it says here that a student got an A on the final. So does this statement meet the condition given by the conditional? Yes. It says if you get an A, it says a student got an A. So because the condition has been met, the hypothesis is true, then we can make the conclusion that this student, which in this case happens to be Felicia, will pass the course. So the conditional is true, the hypothesis is true, the condition has been met, therefore I can apply the law of detachment and conclude that Felicia will pass the course because she got an A on the final. Okay, so that's applying the law of detachment. So let's look at our second example. Again, keeping these two conditions in mind, and actually let's take a look at the same conditional. If a student gets an A on a final, then the student will pass the course. And then it says Felicia passed the course. Now, we go through our two-step process. Is the conditional true? Yes, the condition is true. Conditional is true. Is the hypothesis true? Meaning, is this condition met? Well, what's the hypothesis? A student gets an A on the final. Now, it says Felicia passed the course. Does this statement fulfill the condition? No. This condition, or this statement, fulfills the conclusion, but you cannot reason from the conclusion to the hypothesis, because that would be the converse, and we talked about the converse not necessarily having the same truth value. So here, the condition, the hypothesis, has not been met. She did not fulfill, this statement here does not fulfill the condition. It fulfill the hypothesis. It fulfills the conclusion, but that's not the law of detachment. You have to fulfill the hypothesis. The hypothesis has not been met, therefore we cannot make any conclusion here. We cannot reason, we cannot use the law of detachment, because the law of detachment requires that the hypothesis be met, not the conclusion. Okay, and again, the reason is because if you reason from the converse to the conclusion, from the conclusion to the hypothesis, that's the converse, and we know that the converse does not always have the same truth value as the conditional. If a student wants to go to college, then the student must study hard. Rashid wants to go to the University of North Carolina. So here we're looking, is the conditional true? If you want to go to college, then you must study hard. That's true. Now, has the hypothesis been met? The hypothesis is, we find the word if, a student wants to go to college. Now, Rashid wants to go to university. Is that a college? Yes. So does this statement fulfill the hypothesis? Yes, it does. Therefore, we can now apply the law of detachment and say then that Rashid is going to have to study hard. Right? Another example. You may go to the concert if you clean your room. You may go to the concert. So is the conditional true? Yeah, that's true. You may go to the concert if you clean your room. So that's a true conditional. Is the hypothesis been met? Now, where's the hypothesis? It's not here. The hypothesis follows the word if. Oh, here's the word if. So you clean your room is the hypothesis. Does this statement make this condition true? Has the condition been met? No. Again, this addresses the conclusion, not the hypothesis. So because the hypothesis or the condition has not been met, I cannot use the law of detachment, so there's no way for me to do anything logically given these two statements. Okay, one final example. If a road is icy, then driving conditions are hazardous. Driving conditions are hazardous. Is this a true conditional? Yes, that would be a true conditional. Has the hypothesis been met? The hypothesis is, we find the word if, a road is icy. Does this fulfill the condition? Well, no, this statement does not fulfill this condition. Therefore, the hypothesis is not met. Therefore, the law of detachment is not able to be used. So, again, the most important thing is making sure that the condition is true, and then that the hypothesis is what's being addressed by the second statement. Okay, we cannot conclude that because driving conditions are hazardous, the road is icy. Again, because that would be the converse. The converse and the conditional do not necessarily have the same truth value, and conditions could be hazardous if it's windy or rainy, or any number of other things could make the driving hazardous, not just the fact that the road is icy.